Thank you, everybody. We have just one more panel, and then we'll have some lunch, and then we have the afternoon sessions. So, as the panel said, democracy is really important in its own right, as we all know, but it's also critical to something else, which is prosperity. And if you look at the data that we've been able to produce, the tie between democracy and prosperity is clear. And if at lunch you want to go to the, there's some touch screens where you can actually interact with the data that we've produced and look at country by country scorecards and see the interaction between a country's democratic rights, political accountability, and the level of prosperity that we can see from there. So now we're going to switch slightly to talk about measurements again. As we heard this morning, we've had a major new grant from the Templeton Foundation to look at specifically small and medium-sized businesses and do a deep dive into each country's enabling environment around small and medium-sized businesses. And we call it the Entrepreneurial Policy Initiative. And it's led by our director, Moussa Traoré, and the Atlantic Council from USAID, and before that he was at the World Bank where he worked on this. So I'd like to invite Moussa and the panel up without me falling off the stage.
Thank you very much, James, and hello and welcome to those of you joining us in person and also to our online audience, and thank you for being here. My name is Moussa Traoré, and I'm delighted to moderate today's panel, which marks the official kickoff of a major new initiative here at the Atlantic Council's Freedom and Prosperity Center, the Entrepreneurship Policy Initiative, or EPI. EPI is a response to a gap, and it's also an opportunity. Entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized enterprises are engines of innovation, job creation, and economic growth. In low and middle-income economies, SMEs make up more than 90% of businesses, employ nearly 3/4 of workers, and contribute up to 40% of GDP. And yet, they continue to face significant constraints, from limited access to credit and investment to cumbersome and costly regulatory environments that make it hard to do business. At a time when more than 1 billion people are set to reach working age in the next decade and contend with mounting job scarcity, the case for urgent policy action to empower entrepreneurs has never been clearer. EPI is designed to meet the growing demand for tools that help governments unlock that potential through better data, smarter regulation, and stronger coalition for reform. Made possible by the generous support of the John Templeton Foundation, EPI will do two things. The first is that it will develop a global entrepreneurship policy tracker, measuring the policies that promote entrepreneurship and SME growth in more than 100 countries. And to do this, it will harness AI to improve the speed, scale, and cost efficiency of data collection and processing. The second is that it will launch a global coalition of entrepreneurship policy, convening reform-minded policymakers, private sector partners, researchers, and advocates to exchange and advance real reform. To ensure the tracker's rigor, transparency, and integrity, an independent academic board hosted by Babson College and composed of leading scholars in economics, public policy, and regulatory governance will oversee its methodology and data governance. Our objectives are to establish a trusted global benchmark for entrepreneurship policy, catalyze entrepreneur-centric policy reforms, increase awareness among policymakers and researchers, and build a pipeline of emerging leaders equipped to institutionalize reform efforts. EPI seeks to bring entrepreneurship and SMEs back to the forefront of the discourse on how to create environments where the private sector can thrive, businesses can create jobs, and inclusive growth can take root. To explore all this, I'm joined today by our 4 outstanding panelists. The first is Greg Wolcott, who's Director of Individual Freedom and Free Markets at the John Templeton Foundation. EPI's founding funder, where he works with scholars and practitioners on projects that explore how freedom and markets can foster individual and social flourishing, including entrepreneurship and the moral foundations of business. The second is Dan Barnes, who is Managing Director for Selection and Eligibility at the US Millennium Challenge Corporation, where he guides the corporation's country selection process and strategic research on policy performance. And then we have Patrick McLaughlin as well, who's Vice Chair of EPI's Academic Advisory Board and Research Fellow with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where his work focuses on regulation, the regulatory process, including pioneering the use of machine learning to quantify governance indicators. And last but not least, we have Adriana Vicentini, who is co-founder and CEO of Meg Inteligencia de Datos, EPI's partner data firm specializing in data-driven decision-making across the private sector, public institutions, and political campaigns. So welcome to you all. And now we can get started. I think in terms of questions, Greg, and with thanks again to the Templeton Foundation for its meaningful contribution to get this started, I want to come to you because obviously no good deed goes unpunished. The Templeton Foundation made this initiative possible, and you've thought deeply about why entrepreneurship matters beyond economics. So what was the case for funding an initiative like this, and how does promoting entrepreneurship policy connect to Templeton's broader mission around individual freedom and human flourishing?
Thank you so much for having me here and for this opportunity. This is really great. Before I answer, I would be remiss if I didn't make some acknowledgments. Before I took the role of Director of Individual Freedom and Free Markets, I was my predecessor, Amy Prue, who may or may not be listening. She laid a lot of groundwork for this project, and I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged her very hard work, her reconnaissance, her stakeholder conversations. Also with people like economist Bob Lawson from Southern Methodist University, who may or may not be listening. He did a lot of work doing a landscape analysis for us and Simeon Jankov actually, in fact, too, did a lot of work for us to help us understand the lay of the land, really. And so without their efforts, this would not have been possible. It was only a few years later that I became the director, or a few years before that I became a director and started this work. And so I started doing my own homework, my own reconnaissance, trying to understand, what is the purpose of this? What is the value of it? I had a lot of conversations. I see Joseph Lemoyne is here, who did a ton of work. I've really put him through the ringer, and a lot of conversations to understand what is the value of this potential product. As I was doing that, I came across a lot of scholars and policy reformers and policy advocates who just really, truly impressed upon me the relationship between economic freedom and poverty reduction, and really impressed upon me just the barriers to entry for so many firms and would-be entrepreneurs around the world, and the value of having some sort of ranking and comparison of apples to apples de jure laws and how they're implemented, and how extremely valuable that sort of information would be needed for stimulating reform, and for also for helping countries understand their own trajectories year over year. This was a really big investment for us. So I represent just one part of the Templeton Foundation, but the $10 million for this project is the largest investment from my funding area. You should also mention there's an additional $2 million for the Academic Advisory Board. So this is a huge, huge investment for us, for my team. And you can imagine the opportunity costs. But I had a conversation with the chair of our board, Lee Cameron, and I was discussing this with her and thinking about the possibilities here. And something she said really inspired me. She was like, this is high risk, high reward. And she said, but imagine what the world could be like because of this tool, and compare it to a world without it. And that really impressed upon me the importance of this opportunity and working with the Atlantic Council to bring this forward, and the Freedom and Prosperity Center in particular. There's a lot of money in the sort of space that we work in at Templeton, where we think about entrepreneurship and human flourishing, and the way that free enterprise is the tool to lift people out of poverty. But there's a lot of money going into very specific interventions and trainings to help, particular entrepreneurs and to help them get ready for capital and give them tools and resources. And I think all that is like super, super, super important. I don't want to downplay that at all. But it's not the only thing that matters. We have to tell a kind of a larger picture here. So we were really thinking, okay, what can we do maybe to help move the needle with regard to creating, or at least supporting, political and legal and economic environments for free and open competition, free trade, things, systems that are devoid of the sort of unnecessary and counterproductive regulations that burden some people and oftentimes prop up political elites. And so we wanted to make sure that we were looking at ways we might support any systems devoid of the sort of favoritism and clientelism, patrimonialism, corruption in general. All these isms engender lots of corruption, because all these are always at the expense of human dignity and human well-being. We're always putting the human at the center of this. So this is a part of our long-term vision. We really wanted to think hard about getting the institutions right and doing what we could do to help contribute to this massive undertaking that is, again, just one piece of the puzzle. There's so many other elements needed for spurring entrepreneurship. And again, I want to make sure I thank James Mazzarella, who's over there, who introduced us earlier, and Joseph, and the whole team at the Freedom and Prosperity Center for this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you for betting on us. You talk about high risk, high reward, and we're glad to be contributing to that effort to really understand the development trajectory of countries and how to improve it through this. Shifting to my next question, I want to transition a little bit to the why and the how, and how the metric will work exactly. And so I want to pivot to Adriana to ask you a specific question. Greg's given us a little bit of a vision of a sense of the vision, and I want to get into the engine under the hood, so the data and the technology that will power the tracker. You and your team at MEG, obviously, are data partners, and the perspective tracker that we're developing together is premised on a fundamentally new approach to data collection and analysis using innovative artificial intelligence. Based on your experience at MEG, could you talk us through how the data might be gathered, how it might be processed and translated into indicators across countries?
Yes, gladly. I'm delighted to be here, and to be honest, I can't wait to get to work. I'm ready to start working. So the way we are thinking about this is it's a new system to gather data, right? And it does have advantages over more traditional methodologies, as it does allow us for broader coverage and faster updates and more transparent process overall, right? And of course, with LLMs, large language models, which is the technology that we will mostly rely on for part of this project, it provides for many opportunities. The way we're thinking about it is, so probably let's think 5 layers. So the first one would be source mapping. So it will take some time to figure out what is considered an accountable source in 150 countries eventually, and to get those all in the same place, right? So we want citable sources that are, and getting all those to be accessible. That's a first step, and that's going to take some work. Also, then there's the second layer would be the actual collection and pre-processing of data. So we need to we have come up with a repeatable way to retrieve, archive, and normalize documents, which will vary considerably across regions and countries and languages, right? The third layer would be extraction, and this is where AI shines the most, because, well, it's not just, the focus is not that machines can now read laws, but that is a big aspect of this, right? So the idea will be to create models that can perform a sequence of tasks to get the data out of the decrees, regulations, laws, and to get it right. So accuracy is an important element here. Then, well, this is not so sequential, but the next step, or the fourth step, will most likely be validation. And this is where we bring the humans in the loop. So mostly for border cases and other high risk or high importance outputs. So the reason why I say it's not sequential is because from the get-go, this will be what we're teaching the models. When we train the models, the humans in the academic board mostly, I think, and in the council, will be, calling the shots. The idea is that we can rely on the machines for the vast processing and also for consistency, because coding data or coding legal information allows for interpretation and human bias, which will still be there, but I think it will be in a more controlled manner. Now, after we've validated and dealt with high-risk outputs and edge cases, we would actually go into the fifth stage, which is the indicator construction. And that is about creating or aggregating variables according to publicly available rules. And then this methodology and these rules should be very easily traced. They should be traceable between the rules and what the machine does in order to come up with the indicators, which we will then compare and hopefully get to drive reform to increase available work for people all over the world. So that's the main idea. I didn't want it to sound too technical. And even if, the using AI means that we are now able to somewhat easily put together a system that can connect document retrieval, multilingual processing, structured coding, and quality control into one repeatable production pipeline. That's our focus.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I'm very comforted by the phrasing that you used, the human in the loop. I think all of us, as we navigate a world in which AI is doing so much, it's coding for itself. It comforts me to know that is an element here, and I want to reassure everyone that humans are going to be in the loop. And you've mentioned a few times in our conversations that the use of AI here is really as an amplifying force. It's to increase the productivity. And a conversation that we were also having earlier was around just the fact that AI is going to allow us to update data a lot faster, which means that, for example, if countries are doing interventions or they've basically brought together reform committees to do something, that we are able to update data in more real time.
If we get this right, the big promise is being able to spot change almost in real time and get that in a disciplined manner, have that translate into our data. That would be the gold standard, I think.
Thank you. That gives us a very clear picture of the technological process. But any global benchmark lives or dies by its credibility, as we all know, and that's where the Academic Advisory Board comes in. Patrick, who is the vice chair of that board, you've spent your career doing exactly this kind of work from reg data and QuantGov, so you understand better than most what it takes to earn the confidence of researchers and policymakers. And so global indices involve choices about what to measure, how to define concepts across very different country contexts, and how to weigh indicators. how will the Academic Advisory Board approach those judgment calls, and how will those decisions be made transparent to the data users?
Yeah, thanks, Musa. The board recognizes that any serious index that's spanning 150 plus countries is going to require several judgment calls. That's inevitable. So it's not whether we have them, it's whether those judgment calls are rigorous and disciplined, and whether they've been battle tested, so to speak. Can we defend against the obvious, and maybe even not so obvious, criticisms that will be coming up once something is put out there? And so our role as the board is to be that first layer of battle testing, if you will. We want to look first at the construct validity. And what I mean by that is, are the different concepts being pulled into this project, as Adriana described, the selection and the extraction of the data from the various raw source material, does that correlate? Do the things that we're measuring correlate to the real life outcomes that we care about? Are we seeing things like the time spent on regulatory compliance or how to start up a business even correlate with some of the metrics that we think it should? Do we see end users of regulatory systems, by which I mean entrepreneurs, experience opacity in regulations and in policy in ways that our measurement system also reflects? Again, we want to look for those correlations. And then just outright compliance costs. Are we matching up with what we know about compliance costs across different countries? What we're extracting from the data, does that match up with other known sources that we can validate against? This is, as academics, this is our bread and butter. We're constantly both validating our own material against existing material and telling other people when we referee their reports whether or not their work is valid or would withstand some sort of external critique. Maybe often we are the critics themselves. So construct validity is number one. The second is comparability. Again, the ambition here is huge, 150 plus countries. So we're going to have to be making sure we can look at what we're measuring in this country and ensure it's the same thing or a relatively similar thing in another country, looking across different legal systems, looking across different administrative traditions, and obviously languages. So do the measures hold up across these different traditions that are going to have a lot of effect on both how laws are made, how regulations are made, but also how they're operationalized? And then third, on the weighting selection itself, the aggregation of these different raw source material that we're extracting out of the regulatory text and other policy text, I think the key is just going to be transparency. It's already been hinted at earlier. There's going to be a weighting scheme. We want to test different weighting schemes, and I think we need to be very transparent about the test that we ran, the selections that were made, and maybe even let the user experiment with other alternative weighting schemes that might be farther down the road. But we'd like to see at the end of the day that the user understands exactly where a country's number came from, and they can trace all of the different components of an index back to the source material. Traceability is another key thing here for the transparency element. There's what we're talking probably millions, over 1 million of pages of text that we're going to be collecting, Adriana's team is going to be collecting and extracting data from. Can we take every single data point that's going into these weighted and aggregated indices and connect them back to the source material and make that transparent, make that traceable? I think that's going to be a really key element, and that's something that the board's going to be looking for. Can we trace every single data point back to the original source? So there's other ways that we're going to be looking at it, but those are the three at the top of our list on how we can make sure this project is able to withstand the test of time.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And I appreciate what you mentioned about, does what we put out actually correlate with the outcomes we desire to see? And I think that's where, obviously within the Freedom and Prosperity Center, we study prosperity and, outcomes, prosperity outcomes across the globe, but we also want to ensure from the perspective of small and medium-sized enterprises, that the data that we will be generating on the EPI side will be contextualized in the context of emerging and developing economies. And so we're going to rely a lot on you experts, academic experts on entrepreneurship and how you drive some of those positive outcomes towards prosperity in emerging and developing economies. So thank you for that. I now want to, Patrick has walked us through what rigorous methodology looks like from the supply side. I want to come to Dan, who leads eligibility and selection over at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Dan, I want to bring in a question that gets at what all of this data ultimately needs to do. Because you've worked on governance and policy reform in both the multilateral and the bilateral setting. What does it take to translate a global benchmark like we are imagining and wanting to create? How do we translate that? What does it mean for that to translate into meaningful reform on the ground?
Yeah, great. Thank you for the question, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and to the Templeton Foundation. This is a really exciting initiative. We at MCC are extremely excited for the potential to use this, so thank you for all that you're doing. I kind of sort of structure my response in 3 different buckets. One is sort of understanding the types of data that you're producing, knowing your users, and then figuring out the incentives for the users to actually take that up and translate that through to changes on the ground. On the types of data side of it, we at MCC create these scorecards that we use as a decision rule for understanding the policy environments in countries and how well governed are they to then figure out whether this is a place where we should be pursuing a program. So it's a high stakes use of data. And in doing that, we've discovered a few different things. One, that it creates a bit of an incentive effect for countries to try to pursue reforms. But 2, it also means that we really stress over the details to make sure that we are getting it right. In doing this, we're trying to get a balance between actionable data and data that is really insightful about what is happening on the ground. And preferably those two are the same thing, but they're not always. And so this comes down to things like looking at de jure data, legal laws. Those tend to be more actionable. A country knows what it is they would need to do to increase their performance. But then also trying to look at outcome measures. What is actually happening on the ground? Are you seeing development results? Are you seeing good economic policies translate through to economic growth? And getting a mix of these two is super important for a couple different reasons. One is, again, for MCC, we're trying to understand what's going on in the countries, so we want to have those insightful measures. But the other challenge we have is the users, and for our purposes, it's oftentimes governments or people who are advocating reforms on the ground. They need to understand what the data is measuring. And so the actionable indicators tend to be the ones where it's a little bit easier to understand what is actually being measured, what is it we would need to do to improve performance. And then some of these outcome measures, they can be complicated, they can be using regressions. And so for the users of the data to understand what is being measured, let alone what do I need to do to have an impact on what that thing is. And so getting that mix is just really challenging. So again, we've tried to get this mix of the two, and also because it enables countries to pursue reforms relatively quickly on the actionable indicators, give them some quick wins so they can show that they can have an impact on this stuff, while they are having a longer burn on these more complex questions, figuring out A, what is being measured, B, how do we go about pursuing reforms that will have an impact on those things. So you give them some quick wins while trying to incentivize that longer term thinking on the part of governments and reformers. And then finally, and so that's your user base. How are they going to be using the data, and what incentives do they have to be doing something about it? And in the MCC model, the thing I haven't talked about is that we have a large pot of money potentially on the table if a country pursues reforms and gets the indicators right, as it were. And so that creates a significant incentive effect for people to care about the data that is being produced. In the case of something like this, what are the other mechanisms you might use to get the users to really care about that data and want to pursue those reforms in a sustained fashion across political cycles, recognizing that reforms they adopt today may not have that impact until another election passes. So how are you making sure that there is that sustained interest in pursuing these reforms. This is a challenge. No one's fully cracked the nut. But we at MCC have tried to do it through this scorecard, and we have seen some effect. My colleague on the prior panel noted what we've sometimes referred to as the MCC effect, where countries will pursue reforms to strengthen their performance on our scorecard using data from places like the Atlantic Council so they can qualify for MCC assistance in the future. And that's before we've spent a single dollar.
Thank you very much, Dan. And it makes a clear and compelling case for political will as well, right? To make some of these changes, and what you speak about specifically around action and measuring something that is actionable, that is in the area of competence and influence of these policymakers, is really important, and it's part of the conceptual design, what we are aspiring to develop here. The other thing that I would add to that, that I think connects well with what you're saying, is capacity building around understanding and using the data. Part of this initiative, as I mentioned earlier, is a global coalition for entrepreneurship policy, which is going to bring together a lot of these policymakers and policy advocates to build their capacity to understand and to utilize the data. One of the elements of our coalition is also, obviously, I think I may have mentioned this to so few of you, but will be a fellowship program that will essentially bring fellows from different countries to socialize the data and to help them to understand, but it also creates a feedback loop for us to understand what their needs are to basically be able to measure some of those things as well. So in the first couple years of the convening platform, we will be using that forum to basically do consultations with a lot of these data users and consumers, our audience, as you mentioned. So now I want to zoom out a little bit and put a question to the whole of the panel. I think we've already discussed this in the very introduction, that more than 1 billion young people will enter the workforce in the next decade, overwhelmingly in economies where the formal job creation already lags population growth. So when it comes to entrepreneurship policy, what are we concretely asking governments to get right, and where do most of them, in your opinion, fall short? And I'm inviting anybody to jump in here, but I might also look to Greg and to Patrick and to Dan to kind of step in here and give me some thoughts on, in your experience, what do you think is lacking? Where are governments falling short?
We're not allowed to do any lobbying, so I can't answer. I actually can't answer that question. But I can think about other ways to address it.
Entrepreneurship policy is such a big term. We had our first academic advisory board plenary meeting earlier this week at Babson College, and multiple experts on entrepreneurship there in the room, and they laid the simple fact on us that we don't have a good definition of entrepreneurship to begin with. What is entrepreneurship? Set that aside, because I don't think that's our task to define entrepreneurship. I think we have a more narrow mandate of looking at the policy that might affect just things that lead to or don't lead to prosperity in a given country. And I think where many of the attempts to look at policy fall short are they zoom in on one or two easily identifiable, easily measurable aspects of policy, but they fail to see the whole picture. And it's the whole picture. It's the entire set of regulations that have built up over decades, the other institutions that have built up formally or informally over decades that end up affecting a person's ability to start a business or scale a business or otherwise create the sort of outcomes that lead to prosperity. So to bring it back to this specific project, one of the features is using AI to be able to look at not just a narrow set of policies, but potentially all the policies that we can grab, that Adriana's team can grab, and then ingest those and look at just, is it if you change this one lever, are all the other levers still preventing improvement in that country? And if that's the case, we shouldn't just be focusing on that one lever. Now we can measure them all, and we can have a map of what to change, and we can look at how those changes actually lead to better outcomes over time. If you see over time that one country has identified we can go up the rankings by changing these things, but then we look on the ground and see that entrepreneurs aren't benefiting by moving up those rankings, we can come back and say, all right, are we measuring the right things in this index to begin with? So the holistic approach, the sort of big picture approach, I think is unique to this project, and that is going to fill a gap where a lot of governments currently fail.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think you also pointed to something when you mentioned the big picture that hints at something that's always been top of mind for me, which is really coordination. I think a lot of governments, in terms of when they are well-meaning and wanting to achieve something and really moving the marker for entrepreneurs and making it easier for entrepreneurship and SME growth, sometimes there is a lack of coordination. There are all these disparate efforts to reform in this way through this ministry, but maybe that's not necessarily coordinated with another effort. So I think your point on really having a big picture view, kind of a planning policy effort, is really important, and thank you for bringing that up. Dan, I'm wondering if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm happy to piggyback on that. In fact, this is what we're so excited about with this initiative, is getting that holistic view of what is going on in countries, because without the data, you don't know what the problem is, and you don't know what the solution could be. And so it is absolutely critical. One corollary to this I might flag is MCC's own constraints analysis process. So when we go into a country and we're trying to figure out what should we invest in, we are trying to do basically a systems analysis of the country's economy, and we're really looking at what are the binding constraints to economic growth. There are a lot of constraints to economic growth in the places where we're looking, but what are the few things that if we were to address would have the greatest impact on unlocking growth? And I think this data set is a very similar thing, where by having this information, you can then prioritize among those areas to understand what should we be targeting first. Because you can't target everything. As much as we would like to, you're just not going to be able to hit every single piece of it, but you can figure out, hopefully from this, where, if we were to apply those resources, could we have the greatest impact, start that reform momentum, address the really key challenge, to then move on to the next thing.
And there will be many next things.
Yeah, exactly. Never ending.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Sorry. I appreciate that, Dan. I want to pivot now to also open it up for audience questions. I know that we also have the ability to take questions from the audience in the room and also online. So if there are any questions from the audience here, I think we have some mics around the room if anybody has a question. Want to create that space. I have plenty of questions that I could ask, obviously, but.
Thanks so much. This is an exciting initiative. Very happy to hear about it. I'm Melissa Johns with the United Nations, and I'm curious about your inclusion of systematically excluded groups into this data collection effort. I particularly work on refugees who are frequently barred from working or starting their own businesses formally. But of course, this would apply to women and other excluded groups. And so I'm just curious how this would be captured in your data. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Melissa. We are very much at the conceptual phase right now in terms of development, and it's part of why we are doing such a robust effort for consultation. And we're glad to have you here and to be able to talk about this. I think when you talk about informality, it's something that we've actually been discussing. We had our meeting earlier with our academic advisory board about what are the specific areas that we're going to look at. The shadow economy represents so much of economies. We can't very well develop an indicator that doesn't, at least to some measure, reflect on that reality, right? That said, obviously, we're going to focus on a lot of the things that are published, the legal and regulatory environment, things that are really codified and de jure, but we will, over the next couple years, need to figure out how we include that component. And particularly because you raise the issue of refugees and marginalized populations, which for a lot of them in terms of livelihood, their own business is the only way because they are excluded, and in some ways also excluded from even entering as entrepreneurs. So that is something that we will have to think about critically and that we'll have a keen eye on. I don't know, Patrick, if you have anything to discuss. We gave you, so essentially earlier this week when we met with the academic board, we came to them with a stack of things that we've been kind of thinking about and saying, we need you to tell us, what is really important for us to think about here and what direction to take some of these things. So I don't know if you have something to add to Melissa's question.
I think we're still crafting the solutions, as you said, but they're certainly on the top of our minds. On the board we have one of the world's top experts, for example, in women's entrepreneurship, and I'm sure she's going to be looking for, can we look at some of the outcomes related to women entrepreneurs and see if they correlate pretty well or not with what we're measuring in the de jure components of this whole project. But I don't think we're going to know until we get there. Like, if we know what we're measuring in the de jure components of the project, then we can start seeing how they correlate with some of the other aspects we want to test out. But we will get to the point of testing them.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm wondering whether there are any other.
Yes. My name is Max Trujillo. I'm a consultant here in Washington, D.C. Thank you all very much for your presentations. I wanted to get a sense of, and it was mentioned earlier in the day, the connection between democratic values and open access for businesses. So how are you measuring that component, if at all? And I'm thinking about, for example, past experiences of MCC, like in Nicaragua. I mean, we were expecting many things differently in Nicaragua, and certainly we didn't get it. So is the initiative also taking into consideration how the openness of the business community vis-a-vis the openness for a democratic society? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this gets something that a lot of us ask ourselves in the context of the development world, which comes first, a certain type of governance system or economic growth that leads to that governance system. And so I think one commitment that we've made, and this was also in partnership and in discussion with the Templeton Foundation, is that we won't prejudge the data. We are not going to make certain assumptions that a certain system will necessarily lead to certain great outcomes. And so we're going to let the data speak for itself at the outset, and basically as we gather data and kind of understand what is shaping up in terms of trends, then we'll be able to speak to the matter of, what does a democratic setting mean necessarily for small and medium-sized enterprises versus another type of setting. And so that, I don't know if anybody else on the panel wants to add to that.
Yeah, I would like to add to that because this is a long time coming, this project, to get this passed. And one of the challenges was, what does this tool do and what doesn't it do? And it can't do everything, right? But it also has to be advertised as not doing everything, but be capable of being used by other people to engage in their own projects and also to collaborate with the Atlantic Council and the Freedom and Prosperity Center. We have, our hope at the foundation is that, with this catalytic investment, it will signal to other funders, other organizations, foundations, and so forth, that there's more work to be done to enrich in the story as much as possible. And so I think the sort of question that you asked, sir, is excellent, because it's the sort of thing that we'd hope that in time would become part of the conversation through additional complementary programming.
Yeah, and I do also want to emphasize that, within the center, we have other indices that we also produce. So the Freedom and Prosperity indices, which I think after a few years of gathering data on the EPI side, we'll be able to kind of understand where there is some overlap between, legal and economic freedoms and rule of law and prosperity outcomes, and how the business environment plays into all that. And so that's something that we have a long view towards. So thank you for the question. Sure, yeah.
Hi, thanks. I'm just going to comment as a researcher myself. With regards to quantitative analysis of survey data, in locations, let's say in many cities in this world, that where people live is informal, that technically illegal, and what they do is technically illegal. The question, a big question that would come into mind is, as you've been saying, when we have the data, we're going to look at the data. But what if the data is wrong? Now, there are so many in these surveys, in these kind of informal environments, to not tell the truth. And so one of the challenges is when you get your end data sets that you just assume that they're correct. In my experience, in informal sectors and in urban areas, they're usually not. They're grossly distorted on basic things like where do you live? People don't want you to know. What do you do? People don't want you to know. So a lot of it is there's a real incentive to not tell the truth. And so I'm just wondering how you intend to handle that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the things is obviously the notion that we're going to analyze the data when we have it, but I think I need to be very clear that the goal is not to just outright collect data on 150 countries and publish that right away. It is very much a progressive approach that we plan to take, and to have rigorous testing in that data collection, and to ask ourselves a lot of the questions that you are mentioning right now, which is the data that we see before us, what we are looking at, the results that we are finding, are they credible? Are they expected, or somehow completely outside of the norm that we need to rethink, kind of the original framing or thinking? And so I also want to hand it over to Patrick here in case you have anything to add to this, but I think that it is very much going to be an iterative process where we're going to be asking ourselves these questions, and the academic board's role is to kind of help us contextualize that and bring their knowledge on things such as informality and how we might frame some of these questions.
It's something I don't think we've mentioned yet is the timeline that you have planned, but it's set up for a couple of years of methodological pressure testing. And you're not going to see a publication until at best year 3, right? So there's a couple of years built in to look at these sort of issues and bring them to not just the experts on the board, but other experts in your purview, or in your network, I should say, including yourself, and be able to say, all right, are we getting this right, or are we getting it wrong, and improve and iterate. And there's 2 years of iteration built in, and iteration at the speed of AI is obviously much more rapid than iteration in years past. So, I think the hope is to be able to answer some of these questions better within a couple of years.
Thank you.
You're starting with the de jure laws too,
Yes,
right? Which is a big difference here.
Yeah.
That's the apples to apples comparison first.
We're starting with the de jure benchmarking. We are hoping to also look at developing a methodology through that pressure testing process around de facto measurement, or the practice, how implementation happens, and kind of determining in out years how we might implement that as resources allow. So.
The challenges of surveying and survey methodology are very real, as you've commented, but they're not at the center of the initial methodology. We're starting off based on analysis of regulation, broadly interpreted regulation, and we'll definitely have enough time to go through the methodology and figure out how surveying, if surveying comes in, and how to capture perception more than, de facto, more than what the law says.
Thank you for the question. I know there was one question right here, and then
Hi, thank you. Kristen Oplanik. This is very exciting. We've seen a lot of indices over time, and I think the differential here with the AI component is going to be really interesting in terms of the scale and the speed, as you say. So I'm wondering if it's part of the vision to be able to slice and dice this for things like agriculture that play out very differently in the business environment, or to be able to dig to a provincial level where you can get that kind of within country competition to do better, which has proven very challenging given the burden of data collection without AI in the process. So is this part of the idea, I hope?
Thank you for the question. This is a lot of what we've been talking about, actually. We had this conversation earlier around what, if we're looking at small and medium-sized enterprises in emerging and developing contexts, what are we talking about? Are we looking at real sectors? What are we focusing on sectors? Are we, are we going to have 3 different types of SMEs that we're going to look at? This has been one of the major conversations that we've been having with the academic board already, and so I appreciate your raising it so that I can make that plug. But I think in terms of what we're going to decide on, it's probably going to take us a little bit of time to figure that out. We plan for a process of consultation and literature review and kind of figuring out what makes the most sense, and I think that's also where the academic board is going to come in. And then, obviously, the goal right now is to measure, to have representation and comparability at the national level. I think that very much like de facto measurement, trying to measure at the subnational level can be quite taxing, so we want to make sure that we get it right at the national level first and then consider. And we are hoping, obviously, we have the support from the Templeton Foundation for the next 5 years, and we are hoping for long-term sustainability and support of this initiative, and with more support that we would be obviously branching into that as well. So I appreciate the question. I know that I'm the thing standing between everyone and lunch, so I want to put one final question to the panel. They don't all have to answer it. It's whoever is willing to answer it. But I'm thinking ahead already, and I think the question you raised is to set the stage nicely for that, which is if the Global Prosperity Forum is something that we do every year. If we're sitting here 5 years from now discussing EPI, in essence, what does success look like in 5 years from now? Anybody have any thoughts on that in terms of how useful it is for you? I guess, Greg, this is very much also a question for you.
Yeah, so thank you for that. It's a good question. My sigh was not irritation. It was. I better have a good answer. So I think I'm very influenced by the economist Nobel laureate Edmund Phelps. He wrote a fantastic book called Mass Flourishing that's had a strong impact on me. And part of the reason is that when he talks about all the sorts of things that we associate with capitalist economies, where there's a lot of dynamism, robust growth, innovation, indigenous innovation in particular, and entrepreneurship and so forth. Those economies, there's, as we know in this room, I think there's a lot of strong correlations with a lot of markers of human well-being, health and wealth and so forth. There's also really amazing correlation with experiential well-being, right? Which tells us this kind of broader picture of human flourishing beyond just the numbers that we get, that we can crunch for GDP and so forth. So I was thinking to myself about this, about what does a more entrepreneurial society look like? What does a more dynamic, robust economy look like? And something that occurred to me was that when we're talking particularly about countries in the global south or developing economies and so forth that are struggling, it's not the case that everybody wants to be an entrepreneur in those places, right? So many people are necessity entrepreneurs and so forth, and they're struggling, and it's because maybe they have other skills they would like to contribute to the world, but the firms in their society are too small. They can't hire people because of all these restrictions. The informal sector is inordinately large and so forth. But these people would like to be employees, managers, contractors, investors, and so forth. But they're forced into a sort of a role based on mere necessity. So my hope was that, in 5 years, we start to see changes where countries that are dominated by informal economies of necessity entrepreneurs actually have entrepreneurs who are entrepreneurs because they want to be entrepreneurs and who can grow their firms and hire people so that we have a rich, diverse ecosystem of economy where people can realize their talents in lots of different ways. And so in 5 years, it would be wonderful if we start to see the needle move on this as you start to look at various countries. That would be my hope, right? I mean, that's maybe too optimistic, but we're in this to make the world a better place. So hopefully that will result. So that's one sort of vision I have, is that we actually see people being able to realize their abilities and their skills and their talents in ways that fit them better than just what their circumstances demand.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else from the panel want to jump in?
I'll echo some of what you said, and also what you said, which is the world does not suffer from a lack of indices or rankings. And that's not the outcome that I think we want to see, just another set of rankings. You want to see the changes that can come out of it. And I think Dan said it really well earlier. We want to see, ideally, countries ask, how can I change some policies to move up in the rankings? But then ask, what's next? And if Greg is right, we're going to see that first change lead to more prosperity. So it'll be natural to ask, what's next? How do I get more of that? And so it would be this virtuous feedback cycle that gets built up from this, from asking the first question, how do I move up the rankings, but then seeing what comes out of it and then saying, well, I should do more of that. I think that would be the ideal outcome here.
Thank you.
I'll pile on. I won't be as eloquent as Greg was, but from my perspective, there's some sort of quotidian things that we'd be looking for. One is, has this index advanced our collective understanding of the policy environments that are needed to strengthen entrepreneurship? There's an element of a public good that you're creating here, which I think is going to be incredibly valuable. Two, to the point you were just making, Patrick, are policy makers and reformers using the data to move the ball forward? And what we've seen from our perspective is, yes, there's no shortage of indices out there or really high quality data collection exercises, but actually the number of high quality, globally comparable data sets covering this many countries, they're not that many actually. And so this is a hugely important enterprise that you are pursuing, because people are constantly asking us, well, can't you just go get a better data set for this indicator you're using on your scorecard? And my answer is no. There isn't this data that's covering this many countries. There are really high quality things covering maybe parts of Africa or parts of Latin America, but nothing that's sort of globally comparable. So I can't overstate the importance of what it is you're trying to do here, because there actually is sort of a lack of this kind of globally comparable data.
Thank you very, very much. Sorry.
I just want to add one thing
Sure.
to that. So just to give you a look under the lid here, when this project was going through the review process, one of the challenges we put forth was, here are all these other indices. Now tell us how you're different and how you're complementing all of them. So this is part of the work that these guys had to do, and it's part of the fun of the project. So we do take it seriously, that to the point that you're making, that we're not just hopefully throwing out another, supporting yet another effort, doing something that's already been done. We're trying to make this really make a difference.
Thank you very much for all those comments, and I want to answer my own question a little bit as well. Use my own question to talk. I think, for me, part of the success, and I think this leans very close, or aligns very closely with what Greg was saying, is that I want to see entrepreneurs as part of the conversation on legal and regulatory reform that affects them. It's been very often my experience that, as I mentioned before, governments are well-meaning and they've designed these things, but the entrepreneurs themselves and the institutions that advocate for them are not necessarily included in that conversation. and also they aren't made aware. And so that's just an aspect of good regulatory rulemaking that I hope we are able to move the needle on. So thank you all for a very, very rich conversation. And thank you again to the Templeton Foundation, to Meg for its partnership, and to the Academic Board for its oversight, and also to MCC, which is a potential data user. We want to say thank you. I think what strikes me most is the convergence around a simple but powerful idea here, which is that better data rigorously gathered and transparently governed can change what governments prioritize and what reformers can demand. Sincere thanks to our 4 panelists, so Greg, Adriana, Patrick, and Dan, for your generosity with your time and your candor and your expertise. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being here, whether in person or online. And Greg did this, and I also want to take the time to really thank the people who were so essential to the development of this project. Joseph Lemoine, Nina Danawi-Johnson, James Mazzarella, Will Mortensen, Annie Lee, who were the team that really worked closely with Greg and others to really develop this project from the onset. So thank you to them. And before I let you go, a few logistical notes. For those of us here in the room, you're warmly invited for lunch, which is just ahead. Please do take all of your belongings with you when you leave, as the room will need to be reorganized for our afternoon sessions. And please do stay for what I promise will be a dynamic afternoon. The program features some fascinating conversations, from China's growing reach in the global south, to the future of democracy assistance, to country spotlights on Venezuela, Iran, and Syria, to the intersection of energy, security, and development. There's a lot ahead, and I hope you'll join us for all of it. Thank you very much.